Hello everyone, today we talk about Slavic warfare between the 6th and the 11th century. So it is this half of millennium of actually a very diversified story and also of transformation of great part of European population of Central and Eastern Europe that stretched over a very vast area in fact, and therefore bordering also with different peoples fighting against different enemies in this regard, and that yet we know chiefly from two documentary sources that are the Byzantine manuals, the Strategikon and the Tactica of Leo the Wise, right? So these are two very famous works, the first written basically at the end of the 6th, maybe the beginning of the 7th century, the second at the end of the 9th, in two different times for the empire as well. The Tactica actually copy in part even the Strategikon, but we have to stress here that probably in spite of all this time passed, there were a lot of continuities and similarities. Warfare. And today we will be reading the first, right, mostly what the Strategikon refers to, which is, also much more consistent as a source, much more detailed, right, and this is, in fact, what adds, at least through a Roman filter, the, much of, not just of the, naturally, the tactics, but chiefly of the politics and the strategy of the Slavs as well. Right, and that are very interesting to compare all the way down this hierarchy. And the context naturally is difficult to put in concise terms. Right, we speak, for example, of the Slavs that here are even segmented between the Slavs and the Antes, that were actually an Eastern Slavic population as well, of the northeastern Balkans. The ones with whom also the Byzantines probably fought the most at this point in order to write about them, but it's a distinction that doesn't even make sense much from a conceptual point of view. There was actually a great homogeneity, not just among the Slavs, but also among many other Central European peoples. At this point, the Strategikon, as we will be reading now, even starts saying, basically Slavs were like the Franks, right? There is this identification in a kind of a primitive tribal society of peoples who also spoke, in fact, different languages, and that objectively, also from a Byzantine perspective, didn't. We are talking about the 6th century, where the Strategikon didn't look very different, right? We don't know much actually about the early Slavic migrations. We mostly have this Byzantine bias for that matter, but this Indo-European peoples essentially spreading from the areas of Central Eastern Europe and as tribal populations had originally much in common, right? And even if we talk about the Franks, right, that are actually included within the what the Strategikon calls the blond-haired peoples, right? Even if not explicitly, but that is referred to the Germans. We made a video about that. They were largely infantrymen. They had a few cavalry. They fought essentially with similar political and social forms up to a certain point. And what's the boundary, by the way? What's the boundary, historically speaking, between places like, the one inhabited by the Germans, the one inhabited eventually by the Slavs, right? This is a quite, tricky subject, because actually there is really not much. It's a broad, very large, very extended frontier area, right, in which also historically speaking, what we call the Germans proper and the Slavs proper mixed, right? Look at the German, Polish, Bohemian frontier overall, and even certain traits of the respective national identities. They're deeply intertwined in a way. And aside from this topics, let's remember in this regard that even when interpreting the Strategikon, we shouldn't be so dogmatic about saying, these were these peoples and these others, right? Even for the people, the blonde-haired peoples, Why weren't the Slavs, for example, typically fair-haired, for example, to be called like that? What does it even mean? And we should get this sensitivity even towards the actual refinement of the source, and not reading it in a categorical, dogmatic way, as it's obvious that behind these ethnonyms there is an approximation, and the Strategicon is actually very sophisticated also in terms of, we could even read it actually at the end of today's quoting, a passage that seems to be written by von Clausewitz, that is, now we have tried to enucleate the essential characteristics of these peoples and what actions to take against them, but it's obviously that nobody can foretell the future. We always have to stay sharp and to adapt to every situation as it evolves, right? And when you read, for example, that the Strategicon had in mind for the blonde-haired peoples chiefly the Franks, right? This is something you read in studies, even a certain level, and again you realize that in the very years in which that was being written, actually the most overwhelmingly numerous Germanic group that was fighting against and for at the same time Byzantine Empire were actually the Longbirds. Then you say, why should we talking in general about the Franks, right? And even if there is not even to say that we're talking specifically about the Longbirds, we're talking possibly about all the Germans. So even for the Slavs here, there is the idea that, for example, what would become properly the Western Slavs, right, on the Elbe, on the Vistula, were of course, more far from Constantinople compared to what we eventually know as the Southern Slavs and the Eastern Slavs. But why wouldn't the Byzantines actually know even what was happening up there? And what do you think the Western Slavs were actually differing compared to the other Slavs, or even their bordering Germans that, of course, influenced their warfare, especially at the end of this period? So it's obvious that we will have to come back with a lot of videos on these topics, and to determine more in detail what was, if there were any specific, distinguishing features of local warfare of the various peoples. And of course there were, right? Also archaeology actually gives us some context in this regard. Not all the Slavs were the same. The more you go back in time, of course, the more that is true as for other European populations. But let's say that here it's important to stress also the broader homogeneity, all right, and not to be wargamistically categorical, because it's actually counterproductive. Also, what we can say here before actually reading and commenting the various passages, well, so when we the first stereotype that existed about the Slavs were basically the last Europeans of the migration era, the ones that basically began to move only when the last Germans were settling, right, and even taking their place in many, or look at Poland, right, or other areas of the Balkans, or even of the Ukraine, and that basically overflowed. We talked a lot about the Slavs actually in recent times, also in a video about the Byzantine Frontier during the 6th century. This very scarcely socially stratified and politically disunited, we can say, tribes, or even just clans sometimes. This was true even for some Germans, for example. That literally Slavicide, in fact, this enormous area reaching up to the Peloponnese, basically virtually all the Balkans, up to the Peloponnese. Some took even the sea, going from the other side of the Mediterranean, and creating actually a very important problem for Constantinople, because individually, as all politically divided and fundamentally poor, but at this time, especially during the 6th century, definitely very primitive populations, didn't pose any specific threat, especially from a tactical point of view. These peoples weren't considered to be particularly dangerous, right? At least in certain specific, for example, in open field, right? Very different matter in ambushes or more difficult terrain, as incidentally the Balkans, that are literally a nightmarish ground for any army, are, and that the Slavs knew how to exploit pretty well, but were, let's say, instrumentalized by other populations. That would be the Avars, eventually the Bulgars, partly even the Magyars, but eventually, that fundamentally, pushed them more, or acted in concert with them, usually as subordinated peoples. And this is particularly important, as we will see now, also for the development of the same, especially of Slavic cavalry, that at the end, by the 11th century, actually was pretty advanced, especially the ones of the Eastern Slavs, but not only, right? If you look at our early Polish armies, for example, that they had a pretty high quota of cavalry, but that at the beginning were overwhelmingly infantrymen, right? Which is typical, of course, of quasi completely non-stratified societies, right? And the idea is that actually the Slavs acquire also over time a solid, as we have just said, equestrian culture by being under the influence of steppes peoples, equestrian peoples like the Avars and the Bulgars, etc. Which is reflected, in fact, in the Slavic aristocracy that gradually forms and also creates this, more sound, identifiable political entities, because they were fighting with saber, lance, and bow, with typical, Avar equipment, right, and mastering, the cavalry arm pretty well over time. And for the rest, the other major stereotype, as we were saying before, is the fact that the Slavs were pretty skilled at ambushes, right, at guerrilla warfare, essentially, and they were fanatic defenders. That's another thing that emerges, not just from the Byzantine side, but also from the Frankish one, for example, and we will explain why. And also living at, having this great capacity of exploiting terrain, right? And these are all characteristics of peoples that objectively are reduced to do that because their political and social structures still do not allow them to, to centralize enough to create more consistent military systems, and also naturally due to the resources available. Here we're talking between the 6th and 11th century, the early Middle Ages, so already on average a very materially poor time, right? In history, look at what the imperial army used, like, in Italy during the Gothic War in the 6th century, like wooden armor that can even be good at some time. But even the fact of finding metal, another stereotype of the Slavs is that they fought, let's say, in bracket, naked, which stand for actually without armor, basically, because they really literally didn't have it on a longer, on a broader scale, and that also because they were functionalizing collectively in a more dynamic type of warfare that could fit also this lack of resources, and in regions like Central and Eastern Europe that at this point had basically never been civilized, right? They had not known, differently from the Latin Germanic world, where the Roman Empire had fallen, but fundamentally had remained. Also infrastructurally, also it had certain productivity. So in these areas that we have discussed in Schwerpunkt, also for about the high and low Middle Ages, for the greater difficulty in forming permanent structures, kind of stable governments with difficult communications, areas covered with in swamps, and actually very varied, forests, mountains, rivers, but areas that had never been taken away from nature in a way. They were not reclaimed, they were not that were very difficultly put to culture. The Slavs were actually pretty resilient in this and accomplishing also a lot over this centuries in expanding and settling, right? The Slavs are at this point, we can talk about semi-nomadic in the sense, up to the point that they kept migrating, but of course when they stabilized, they maintain sound sedentary aspect that also differentiates them quite clearly, also in their military style, from the peoples of the steppes that were continuously in contact with, right? And that, in fact, even influenced pretty and brought to certain military solutions, even of weaponry, that is very interesting, is often overlooked, even for further military developments in medieval Europe, in order to cope, especially against horse archery, right? And finding the best solutions. The same Byzantines actually were capable of replicating steppes tactics, fighting actually with the same, steppes peoples in their ranks. So the Slavs were creating a response with this pretty flexible, yet desperate, if you want, formula that, however, allowed them to, eventually maintain their presence, to, in great part, not to be assimilated, to create their dominions and to develop into what also the modern countries fundamentally have originated from. So this is very interesting, and once again we will come back on it on multiple videos. Today we just read and comment the Strategicon, and also partly the Tactica that actually repeats largely the Strategicon, and it's also shorter, but we'll see now. And we go here with what I have, the 11th book of the Strategicon, chapter. Here I have two versions. One says 20, another 4, but I mean, it's the 11th book is dedicated basically to all the barbarians. This is, all the enemies of Constantinople, of the Roman Empire, which is titled, naturally in translation, dealing with the Slavs, the Antes, and the like, right? And as we said before, we're essentially talking about the Slavs, or whoever. Naturally, the Slavization of many areas of Europe didn't mean that the local cultural elements disappeared. It basically blended in with the newcomers, and also conferred them certain characteristics for which we distinguish, in fact, different areas of the Slavic world. And we will not read it all together. We will stop and comment. The nations of the Slavs and the Antes live in the same way and have the same customs. So this statement naturally means, as we were saying before, that we're talking largely about homogeneous people, that trying to differentiate doesn't quite make sense. They are both independent, absolutely refusing to be enslaved or governed, least of all in their own land. Right, so this is also another characteristic that was a problem for the Roman Empire. Was used to deal with kind of more, concrete political realities. Right, even with the Germans, the Byzantine diplomacy had worked to condensate fundamentally certain groups under the rule of a single leader that could be, addressed politically, and that would, keep an eye essentially on all these clans that made up the Germanic populations that were largely, in fact, unruly in that regard, they didn't have a central government. About the Slavs, this was even worse, right? They couldn't be controlled properly, right? This human tide was so autonomous and fragmented that there was not a point of reference. And the reference naturally also to the fact that they didn't want to be enslaved or governed in any way reflects this fanatic pride of the Slavic people as tribal societies that cared about freedom more than anything else, right? Because they were fundamentally so devoid of other structures internally to their own society that could defend them from outsiders. They had to deal with the thing on their own, right? And failing to do this individually brought to the end of their own small community, their own family, their own clan. And there was no way, essentially, even to lure them into the benefits of, for example, of a Roman society. At this point, it was even decaying, right? It was even presenting those weaknesses that the same Slavs were exploiting, like, for example, occupying the whole Byzantine countryside, living just the coasts under the Roman government. These people naturally were migrating for getting new land, right? And and settling there, and therefore refusing at that point, however, generally to obey the local authorities. In some cases, actually would happen. Right, most of the areas what we consider, in fact, the Byzantine Empire were Slavicized in the hinterland, and over time they grew to be Roman. Right, but the difficulty of controlling them in general, and also preventing the rise of other powers. Think about, I don't know, Serbia. Theoretically, I mean, it was within the Byzantine Empire. It rose within the Byzantine Empire, but from their own perspective, they basically had always been the Serbs in that regard, wherever they had come from, partly from Eastern Europe, partly even from Slavs that had settled on the Elbe, albeit it's debated, but still dealing with their own business and not liking much the idea of being under a Roman emperor, if not for certain political needs of even fighting against the neighbors, etc. But these relations will be observed in other videos. And because they deserve, actually, in this regard. We're naturally very pragmatic, as you can imagine. But in this original phase, the idea of freedom of the Slavic people was naturally very, very evident, right? And it's interesting also how the Strategicon distinguishes between the fact that the Slavs didn't want to be governed, but especially when they were within their own land, right? And what does this mean is kind of strange, because in part, we don't really know much about the early Slavic migrations. There are debates even on the actual area from which they stemmed. But the idea is that, they came to settle largely into areas that had not belonged to them previously at this point. So the interpretation I like to give to this is that, of course, there was a subtle difference between what, was considered as your own, as a land you had settled in, and you had, for example, put into culture, and you had worked on, and that was considered by you to be your own land, right? This has nothing to do with would that land had belonged, because basically nobody owns its own land, since the dawn of mankind, as that criterion. But naturally, it acquires a meaning as long as you dwell in there and you build a future in it and you work for it. But here the Strategicon goes on and says, but by the way, this, however, addresses the fact that the Slavs saw definitely a principle of territorialization of their political their political agenda, right? They realized that this was not a temporary stay, like it could happen for a nomadic population, right? Even actually the peoples of the steppes, like the Avars, the Bulgars, the Magyars, were when they arrived, were thinking like in nomadic terms, but in some generation they naturally settled down. So with the Slavs, this was even naturally far more evident. Then the Strategicon writes, they are populous and hardy, right? Bearing readily heat, cold, rain, nakedness, and scarcity of provisions, right? So this is a bit of a stereotype you find even in the Roman sources for the Germans, right? The idea that these people were numerous, right? They even cared properly about their own stock in fertility terms. Like, this is typical of people. You find it even, I don't know, we found it even for the Moors in North Africa, when they said, that the children, the offspring, was the future of these peoples, because their life was usually poor, meager, and short, right? And in order to work, to fight, naturally you had to count soundly on your next generations. And they were hardy, being rarely this resistance to the weather, right? That is, sometimes in Roman historiography goes a bit in both ways, because from one side, if you read, for example, the part on the Germans of the same Strategicon, says that the Germans usually didn't resist much. That there's a force of extreme weather, right? Because they had poor supplies systems, and this is valid also for the Slavs, actually. So there are naturally, not everything that is written is completely rational or spot on, but naturally, even the nakedness here, it naturally means the scarcity, together with scarcity of provisions, the lack of sheer resources, right? The fact that these peoples lived in the wild, naturally, from a Byzantine perspective, from the civilized world of the Mediterranean, they lived in conditions for which they had to live and work hard in order to even think to survive, right? Any lands that were definitely not very productive at this point, considering fact, as we were saying before, these lands had been largely abandoned by other peoples that had shifted, in fact, towards the Mediterranean, right? And abandoning areas that were less productive. These were the ones that had fallen into the hands of the Slavs. Then the Strategicon writes, they are kind and hospitable to travelers in their country and conduct them safely from one place to another wherever they wish. If the stranger should suffer some harm because of his host's negligence, the one who first commended him will wage war against that host, regarding vengeance for the stranger as a religious duty. Now, there are lots of anthropological interpretations of this passage. There is a beautiful book by Mozzalewski, the Europe of the Barbarians, right? Barbarian Europe, that deals in detail with the concept of hospitality, since in the from the ancient sources onwards about the Germans, about the Slavs, and these were all political and socially driven customs. Fundamentally, here, even the fact that there is, if there is an element of the Slavic society that produces damage to a foreigner, that the Slavs feel the need to punish this person. It sounds very much like, we have to, since we are generally divided and we are exposed to enemy threats, if we even create more enemies than we should, things are not going to go well. So there was a kind of a reaction against those who behaved in an undisciplined way. And this is very, very interesting, because naturally the Slavs now were entering in a game that was in many ways greater than them, right? Becoming neighbors, very close neighbors, actually next door neighbors of the same Romans, of other very ferocious and rapacious peoples that also enslaved them, and even interfered with their political affairs heavily. We've seen it in the last videos about the Byzantine Frontier, how even the Byzantines allied with the Avars, that were their arch enemies at this point, against some Slavs, for example. So, meaning that definitely now that the situation was much more complicated it had been in the past, and or at least they started regarding this this broader international policy as a big deal for them. They do not keep those who are in captivity among them in perpetual slavery as do other nations, but they set a definite period of time for them and then give them the choice either, if they so desire, to return their own homes with a small recompense or to remain there as free men and friends. This is also a very euphemistic way to say that, of course, the Slavs, as any other people, had slaves at this point, and that they also, enslaved themselves, so to other peoples, so getting simply enslaved by others. At what actually the name Slav actually comes from in this period, and the. But that they saw naturally, even in prisoners, possible future friends if they show them mercy, so that maybe this neighbor where it had been, and if the war had been not actually started by them, might have been grateful towards them and possibly being their next friends against a common enemy, which naturally reflects also a situation that was present within the same Slavs that fought happily against each other on a regular base, but naturally so always this, in future perspective, the possibility of, interplaying, right, with this kind of political flattery. For the rest, these were as brutal and merciless peoples as every human being can be, so this has nothing to do with any, qualitative trait of one people, as if there was anything like that, but just about sheer political convenience. Then they possess an abundance of all sorts of livestock and produce, which they store in heaps, especially common millet and Italian millet. And their women are more sensitive than any other. So agricultural resource, of course, their women are more sensitive than any others in the world. When, for example, their husband dies, many look upon it as their own death and freely smother themselves, not wanting to continue their lives as widows. Right? This has probably not much to do even with the simplicity of their own social structures. That is, that they're almost at a nuclear level, right? And that is, if your husband dies, you're not going to have much future in the first place. And also, this is probably a dramatized perception of naturally of peoples that having an important part of their warriors killed, they didn't have much to rely on, and so would just prefer to perish in a way. Then they live among nearly impenetrable forests, rivers, lakes, and marshes, and have made the exits from their settlements branch out in many directions because of the dangers they might face. Right, so society that even in the settlement reveals this constant insecurity, right, and instability that derives naturally from a high level of militarization, the fact that the local structures are fragile and they can be wiped out easily even by just a raid, and for which the whole society is functionalized to find a to resist and to find a solution, even an escape route, like in this case. They bury their most valuable possessions in secret places, keeping nothing unnecessary in sight. It's also very interesting and is characteristic of the migration era, right, from which we keep finding a lot of buried treasures. People who would that were aware, in fact, of the possibility of having to change site from a moment to another, and saying, okay, let's remember, just we buried this valuable goods in here, and then maybe they didn't make it, they didn't come back, and they were left there. And this naturally also has to do with the immediate, right? Everything that is unnecessary must not be left inside. They live like bandits and love to carry out attacks against their enemies in densely wooded, narrow and steep places. Right? This is actually a quite subtle perception of the fact that the Slavs fought avoiding to expose themselves as much as they could. Right? In this densely wooded, narrow and steep places, right, in which they could take advantage, possibly, of the difficult path, even to attack the enemy that was not deployed in battle formation, that was dispersed, and naturally having to know necessarily the terrain, right? And they make effective use of ambushes, sudden attacks, and raids, devising many different methods by night and day. Their experience in crossing rivers surpasses that of all other men. This is interesting. And they are extremely good at spending a lot of time in the water. Right? As we'll see now, this refers mainly to not just to the Nubian affluence in general, I mean to the Balkanic and Pannonian area. And these methods that naturally are designed to, even to have a greater strategic mobility of these bands, fundamentally, that needed to move very fast in order to catch the enemy by surprise, enacting these raids, exploiting the darkness as well. So needing to disappear quite quickly, to be able to cross the water as quickly as they could. And even here, spending a lot of time in the water proper, and we will see now why. Often enough, when they are in their own country and are caught by surprise in a tight spot, they dive to the bottom of a body of water. There they take long hollow reeds they have prepared for such a situation and hold them in their mouths, the reeds extending to the surface of the water. Lying on their own backs on the bottom, they breathe through them and hold out for many hours without anyone suspecting where they are. An inexperienced person who notices the reeds from above would simply think they were growing there in the water. But a person who has had some experience with this trick, recognizing the reeds by the way they are cut or their position, either shows them further into their mouths or pulls them out, which brings the men to the surface, since they cannot remain underwater any longer without them. Right, so this sounds like just like even a funny anecdote in a way, but it probably reflects, among other things, the capacity of the Slavs exploiting terrain in here. And in this marshy areas, you think about the Danubian, especially in the lower Danubian, in the Istria, how, swamps even are, feature like of the terrain that is the frontier with the Roman Empire. And how this could be exploited, especially in the open, right? Think about, you have to hide in swamps that are usually in flatlands, right? So that doesn't probably, is not far from the truth. Naturally, I doubt every Slav knew how to, to be able to breathe underwater through these reeds for consecutive hours without being spotted and everything. But we can't know actually how far this lifestyles actually could bring these people to adapt to something that we would conceive as unthinkable. But when you have to save your own life, really humans can adapt to. So yeah, that's possibly realistic actually. And the passage also suggests it was done in groups. Right, so that there is an entire band that maybe can't hide in that way, and disappearing from the radar, right, very very effectively. Then we go on. They are armed with short javelins, 2 to each man, which is the normal panoply for a tribal warrior. Right, since the ancient world, if you look at how a normal tribesman gets equipped with, it's essentially 2 or 3 javelins slash spears. Like in this case, these are shorter javelins apparently, that suggest a higher functionalization for skirmishing rather than hand-to-hand combat. Right, but even here there is no standardized category. And sometimes nothing else, or just a small shield. And talking about shields, the strategian also writes, some also have nice looking but unwieldy shields, right? And in here there are actually representations. We'll have to talk about this more specifically in detail, about Slavic warriors actually using certain specific shield designs that probably we don't know much about, that however conceptually are actually spread all over the Slavic area. They even gave life to later medieval shield forms, like similar to the Targurs, for example, even to smaller cavalry shields you can find, since even in Lithuania up to in Croatia, right? That were specifically rectangular, not oval, right? And some of them are to be found even big size. In fact, this nice looking but unwieldy shield actually points to me to those specific forms. And the reason I think why the Slavs were developing this kind of shields was essentially countering the missile power of their enemies, right, of horse archery, of these steppe peoples that concentrated much of their effectiveness of it. Being the Slavs, as we've seen, materially poor and often lacking armor, they tended to probably improve mostly their shields, covering therefore also at the angles. Let's say if you look at the ovals, it's trying to cover with a rectangular form, the edges that remained unprotected in this sense, and even developing certain semi-mobile forms of shields that were used to present this front to just parry arrows, fundamentally, and to spare naturally unnecessary losses. And I think the formation of these shield forms are pretty, make pretty much sense if you look at how and why the design spread in Slavic area. It's because you get some of the lightest armored peoples out there that have to counter some of the most missile powerful peoples out there, and therefore the shield is gonna at that point be more cheaply, but also more effectively, the thing you will invest in order to defend yourself from the darts. Also, the Strategicon writes, in addition, they use wooden bows with short arrows smeared with a poisonous drug, which is very effective, right? So if the wounded man has not drunk an antidote beforehand to check the poison or made use of other remedies which experienced doctors might know about, he should immediately cut around the wound to keep the poison from spreading to the rest of the body. Now consider always that the Strategicon here is not an ethnographical work. I mean, it obviously has much of it, but it's still a military manual. So this, as we will see better later, also in this position for fighting in the territory populated by the Slavs, that there are always advices and suggestions and ideas on how to cope with the enemy, in this case the Slavic arms, and the tactics in general. Naturally, here we see a further functionalization of these bows that do not sound as anything particularly impressive as such, right? These are not definitely the composite bows of the steppes that were renowned by the Byzantines, that the same Strategicon talks about when discussing the hours, for example. These are small, typical European bows, actually, and with even smaller, short arrows that, however, are increased in effectiveness by poisoning the tip, right? And this was used, that technique used by all peoples fundamentally, but the fact that the Slavs would enhance it, apparently so, to look distinctive in this, also suggests the fact that probably they didn't have many other resources to cope with the enemy in that regard. Probably bows that didn't have such a great performance, but at least, okay, let's make its darts poisonous so that at least we can make it. And this naturally should be also conceived under the light of the same Slav against Slav warfare, right? Because obviously if you fight against people who are usually poorly armored, as your fellow Slavs, creating more losses through poisoning the darts is going to be more likely than if you have to shoot a fully armored Byzantine in that regard. So this is also the reason why this thing is renowned. Naturally, this entails also a broader knowledge even of the ingredients, the natural substances that you could bring to this, etc. But this also was a shared knowledge among tribal populations and even by the most advanced medicines of, the same Byzantines, etc. Owing to their lack of government and their ill feeling towards one another, and this tells it all, right? They're not acquainted with an order of battle. Now, this is very fascinating as a statement, because it says, they basically don't have a government proper, which they actually had, like every human society. But it was a very, simple one. And they also felt generally ill towards one another, which meant that they probably didn't find a common ground or organization. They didn't share many resources. They didn't centralize enough to create even an order on the battlefield that could count on some sort of cohesion, collective training of sorts. Of course, they fought with like all other people's informations, etc. Here, the Strategicon is overly dramatic because the Slavs are pictured in some of the basically least effective of the various barbarians from a military point of view. But there is something true in it, in the sense that, you know, this is an important, even strategical reality. I mean, the fact that sometimes whether you have to meet the enemy in battle, if you can be more effective with guerrilla, right, and other, let's say, enclosed space tactics, let's put it in this way. The strategician says they are also not prepared to fight a battle standing in close order, or to present themselves on open and level ground, right? So they will simply not do it, right? It's not that they actually couldn't fight in close order. Of course they could, but they wouldn't, because they would expose themselves too much, right? On a level ground, they prefer, tough ground. There's a lot of chronicles everywhere, from all the, from the Byzantines, from the Longobards, from the Franks, that talk about the Slavs fighting always, usually on hilltops, having also this, in fact, they're saying before, a fanatically defensivistic military culture that has its pros, but also its cons at the same time. And it says if they do get up enough courage when the time comes to attack, they shout all together and move forward a short distance. If their opponents begin to give way at the noise, they attack violently. If not, they themselves turn around, not being anxious to experience the strength of the enemy at close range. Now this is interesting, because it actually reveals what was happening on another scale also for other peoples. I mean, the fact that battles in general were not about a direct attack. All of a sudden, there was always, a phase of testing, of realizing, what were, I don't know, the weak spots in the enemy lines. This kind of wearing out the enemy also. The strategic also, like Byzantine tactics, were highly sophisticated in that sense themselves, right? And even in here, it's not that the Slavs couldn't make a mass charge, right? Like the Germans are the blonde-haired peoples in this strategic are the ones who are best at that, even if they're not particularly orderly. Here, the Slavs could do that too. They were just less prone to do it, and usually they preferred just to to scare the enemy off, which is largely what the psychology of battle really is, right? It's not about the actual physical clash. It's chiefly a psychological thing, right? So if the enemy is already intimidated by the appearance of the Slavic host and these shouts, right, as war cries, used by everybody at this point, and in which probably the Slavs also relied more, perhaps more than other peoples in that regard. During the migration era, everything. Think about the Roman barritus, right? The ancient Roman legionaries were famous for being silent, even if you really read sources, you find that even Republican early imperial legionaries actually shouted before the attack. But naturally, there is also this cultural, spiritual dimension of the shout. As in this case, it sounds very much like a war cry in the moment of the charge. But naturally, these peoples also, there was all a preparation, a spiritual commitment by, taunting the enemy, boasting their own ancestors. The Slavs, even at a very late stage in medieval history, you realize, compared to more, feudal realities like already Germany was by, the 13th century, they if you read their sources, they were very much tied already to this ancestral tribal background, the idea of the ancestors as part of their stock, right? And this sense that there was a commonality on a clanic base that they also needed to to show in front of others. They were proud and courageous and and dare, right, in the first place as warriors, as freemen, and if they if this shout was in charge was enough to make the enemy freak out, which is what charges are designed to in the first place, the Slavs would press on and hopefully overwhelm the enemy. If not, they would come back, right? And don't think, even think about cavalry charges, they were done like this, right? You don't have to think about entire units, entire companies kind of moving all together, charging all of a sudden. There were many tests. There were several units that went back and forth, like testing the weakest spot in the enemy ranks, and okay, let's do there and there, and eventually decide where to launch the attack. And naturally, also this fact of turning back and not giving up the fight was a matter of saying, okay, well, we don't have to suffer unnecessary losses in this regard. And the fact that now the Slavs are stereotypized as the ones who do it more normally, it's because evidently they had less capabilities to fight in hand-to-hand combat as formations. That they probably had poorer equipment. They had more to risk in that regard. And don't think that having a state or even just a kingdom or a tribe, or a kingdom behind you, politically, socially, that doesn't make a difference, because as a tribe, as a clan, you're going to reason in a much more individualistic way, and this is what actually creates the problem of even fielding an army in open field, because in a pitched battle, because that's where you risk too much in an overwhelming scale that is too risky, right? And then they run for the woods, where they have a great advantage because of their skill in fighting in such cramped quarters, right? Which really shows you what the thing means. It's not that the Slavic warrior was bad at close, hand-to-hand combat. It's just that in collective, training, they kind of sucked, right? Because there was no central government to impart to confer that discipline, that collective level of discipline. But naturally, in the woods, in this difficult ground that would break the enemy formations, etc., they would engage, right? Because they were even more skilled in living within that environment, even for movements, for exploiting, for measuring energies, etc., right? A Byzantine soldier would have naturally a pretty good idea of what it meant to to economize on its physical resources, but chiefly at a let's say unit level of some scale, right? In maneuvering, marching, etc. A Slav would be kind of best, in fact, in single combat in such difficult grounds, right? But when it took to fight the bigger clash in open field, there were many reasons not to, right? Because it was even difficult to manage these groups all together in that situation. Often, too, when they are carrying booty, they will abandon it in a feigned panic and run for the woods. Right, so this is fascinating because it makes you realize that also this retreat, right, this also apparent, proclivity to flee, right, to avoid hand-to-hand combat, could become so stereotypical to trick the enemy into fake, in order to track them into a feigned route, and luring them with the booty, and that's kind of fascinating because we know of many battles that were lost because the enemy was seemingly broken, then the army broke formation and began to loot the field, and then the enemy came back, right? And the fact that here running for the woods, right, also highlights the fact that the Slavs ran into that. You didn't see that anymore. Were they broken? Were they retreating, or were they for an ambush? It was a great problem because if you don't enter in the woods, you will never know. And if it turns out if you enter in the woods, Slavs are way more effective than they are in open field, and that's gonna be quite a calamity for someone who's not adequately prepared to fight in those conditions. Then when their assailants disperse after the plunder, they calmly come back and cause them injury. Here's the point. And they are, which by the way is interesting also for another reason. That means that when the enemy is dispersed, naturally the Slavs do not have any problem actually at attacking them, which is also probably having to do with themselves having a minimal cohesion, because at that point it would be kind of even silly not to exploit it, and to overwhelm just with the cohesion of a concentrated mass that this dispersed nuclei of enemy, right? And this can vary at different scale. It's obvious that Slavs went to war even in large blocks, right? The problem is really how you coordinate them and how you make them act as one. With discipline, which line of command? If every 50 people are commanded by a different clan leader, right? That is a problem. They are ready to do this sort of thing to bait their adversaries eagerly and in a variety of ways. Also, the fact that the enemy is attracted by plunder means that the Slavs themselves usually were raiding around and carrying loot with them. That is what every army did, but here more stereotypically so for peoples that use this hit-and-run tactics and strategy, actually. They are completely faithless and have no regard for treaties, which they agree to more out of fear than by gifts, right? So this desperate condition for which you don't really, agree because you have much choice to ponder what you can do with that agreement, right? Either you agree or you die. So at that point, if there is another, if the situation changes and you can obtain something more favorable, including not dying next, you will break the treaty, right? And this was a problem, as we have said before, for the Byzantines, that were instead trying to do exactly the opposite, the reliable interlocutor in an area, in a stabilized political context instead. There was no way even. When a difference of opinion prevails among them, either they come to no agreement at all, or when some of them do come to an agreement, the others quickly go against what was decided. So this is, another face of the same medal, in the sense that, even in here they do not decide something because they have much of an option. So those who want to act in a certain way will automatically discontent others that will have no other option but to say no, and then they will start fighting among each other as a consequence. They are always at odds with each other, in fact. Nobody is willing to yield to another, right? So either, this is really a matter of survival. Either I survive as a clan, or I don't trust the others. Because there's no higher authority here that can, provide that level of security. That is the real problem. Of course, in later times, now we're talking about the 6th century, in the 11th century, it will be very, very different. There will be already monarchies that have been created, still unstable, but already something, right? And oligarchies have formed, they're powerful. Even the Slavic armies have changed in character. But by the 6th century, this is the grim reality of living without there's not a real people here besides the Slavs themselves, right? So the other subdivisions are inconsistent. In combat, they are hurt by volleys of arrows, sudden attacks launched against them from different directions, hand-to-hand fighting with infantry, especially light armed troops, and having to fight on open and unobstructed ground. Right. Now, what is interesting here is, they're basically vulnerable to missile fire. That is something that we've seen that even if countered with somewhat desperate means is still, something that damages them. You would expect they are actually more vulnerable from heavier troops. Instead, they're actually from light armed troops, which means, once again, this is not a matter really of hand-to-hand combat per se, but really the fact of being, let's say, exposed to missile fire of some sort, because the light armed troop here, what's the deal, right? They're, it's easier for them to fight against heavy infantry. I don't think so in that regard, because they're, less equipped, unless they fight, in fact, on more difficult ground. But this is the picture of kind of an open ground combat in some ways. But the point is that light armed troops can fight better on their own ground. So paradoxically, they would prefer to fight against something more consistent sometimes, or more easily, that is more cumbersome, right? Like heavy infantry on a wooded terrain than the light infantry that is more agile in that context. And they suffer themselves of fighting on an unobstructed ground, right? And once again, they're vulnerable in open ground. Our army, the Byzantine one, therefore should comprise both cavalry and infantry, especially light-armed troops or javelin throwers, and should carry a large amount of missiles, not only arrows, but also other throwing weapons. Bring materials for building bridges, the kind... There's another passage, I don't know whether it's the same, I think it's... we will read it later, but the reason here is that actually... arrows or stones are less effective in a wooded terrain than javelins are, right? You must naturally throw the javelin a shorter range, but it's for the visibility and also the the spatial limits, javelins are better in that context. So bring materials for building bridges, the kind called floating, if possible. In this way you may cross without effort the numerous and unfordable rivers in their country. So they're talking about the Nubian base, and what he's saying here is that basically you have to counter them with their own tactics, because we have seen before that the Slavs are the best of the barbarians to fight, to cross the speediest to cross rivers, right? At least smaller groups, and build them in a Scythian manner. Talking about the bridges, some men erecting framework, others laying down the planks. You should have also ox hide or goat skin bags to make rafts, and for use in helping the soldiers swim across for surprise across against attacks the enemy in the summer. So this is a way to say, okay, if they count on this surprise, but they can also get easily surprised. And the fact that, okay, they can run away more easily, they're more skilled in that sense, but still, being attacked by surprise for them is kind of also a problem, also because they largely don't build the same defensive measures that, the Roman army at this point. Still, it is preferable to launch our attacks against them in the winter, when they cannot easily hide among the bare trees, when the tracks of fugitives can be discerned in the snow, when their household is miserable from exposure, and when it is easy to cross over the rivers on the ice. The fact of attacking in winter will be the same strategy the Mongols would enact to invade Russia, for example, right? Because the rivers were frozen. Also, in fact, in spring, all these lands would turn into a marshland. So there were sound reasons for behaving like this. But what is fascinating, I would say, is the fact that there was an actual advantage deriving from, for example, the trees' leaves, for example, here, so that they couldn't hide under them in winter, and which really gives you the dimension even of how small sometimes these Slavic contingents were, right? When he says that they're like brigands, it's because many clans actually fought even with that kind of scale of military commitment, right? The fact that they can also be traced more easily in the snow, so that reveals the difficulty in summer to follow their traces, because they knew the terrain pretty well and they were quite quick at getting away. And most of the animals and superfluous equipment should be left behind in a very safe place with a suitable guard and officer in charge. That is to say, watch out, because these guys are likely to assault our cattle, our animals, and they're always there potentially. So the concept here is that you should keep a suitable guard, right, with someone responsible here, because Slavs could attack from any moment, right? It can be everywhere. They kind of mimetize in this savage landscape, right, and of the Balkans. And the Dromans also should be anchored at a strategic locations. This is interesting because the Slavs there is all a part of Slavic warfare consisting of river operations, not just on rivers actually, but also on the sea, right? On the Adriatic, there was a consistent Slavic piracy already at this time. The Longobards kingdom was raided. Sometimes were kind of small intensity raids, actually nothing, kind of threatening to the unity of a local government, but still economically damaging, of course. And think also the great Russian rivers, the Kievan Rus, and even this major naval expeditions against the same Byzantine Empire. At the beginning, they were actually, not very threatening as such, but they were capable of very far range of strategical range of operations. And this also speaks for that ability of crossing rivers easily. And these boats they were fairly small, like they could be easily built in a short amount of time. And here the strategicon is saying, keep a watch also on your boats, because the Slavs are going to steal them as well. And a moira of cavalry under outstanding officers should be stationed in the area as a protection, so that the army on the march shall not be distracted in the event of hostile ambushes, and so to spread the rumors that an attack against the enemy is being planned in some other location. By means of such rumor, and the anxiety of their chiefs, each of whom will be worried about his own problems, they will not have the opportunity to get together and cause trouble for our army. And also, do not station these troops close to the Danube. So it's talking obviously about the major river frontier of the empire, for the enemy would find out how few they are and consider them unimportant. Right? Nor should they be very far away, so there will be no delay if it becomes necessary to have them join the invading army. They should stay about a day's march from the Danube. So this is not just a tactical but a strategical tip, that is, always maintain an adequate force close to the Danube, but far enough essentially from Slavic reconnaissance, so that you can't always, keep them in check, right, and oblige them to push too far and to be overwhelmed eventually, and always make them believe that we're next to attack, so that they basically will fear the thing, will quarrel among each other. The ones who are closer to our frontier will actually tend to be, more from our side, to be more gentle. So these are all essentially not just strategical but also political moves on how to cope with the Slavic tribes. This army should cross over into enemy territory suddenly and make its invasion on clear and level ground. Immediately, let's not risk to go, the tough ground, the valleys, the forests, the areas where the Slavs could actually set up an ambush, right? Immediately, a competent officer should ride ahead with some picked men to take captives from whom it will be possible to get information about the enemy. As far as possible, avoid marching through rough or wooded terrain during summer until thorough reconnaissance has been made, and in case the enemy is present in force, until they have been driven away by our infantry or cavalry. If we have to march through a narrow pass, and if we expect to return by the same route, measures must be taken, as explained in the book dealing with this matter, to clear the way, widen the road, or to leave a relatively strong force behind in the area to prevent the enemy from hiding and making surprise attacks, which could overwhelm our army on its return when it's likely to be encumbered with plunder. Right? That is to say, the Slavs are going to do that. So always be extremely careful, because they hide. It's easy, as we've seen, to invade their land, but it's not easy to come out safely. of it, and a proper disposition of the troops should be done. You should always kind of avoid the most difficult terrains, which should be speedy, disorient them at the beginning, because we have seen that their political ties are weak. So in order to even formulate a common response, it takes time. So the quickest we are, the better it is. This is valid naturally for other realities, for other peoples as well. But it's interesting that is in among these people, for example, I don't know, in other paragraphs about other peoples, there is not such a detailed dispositions and times and how to cope with them, even specific at a strategical level. There is for some, not for others. So this is important. There is even the geographical reference of the Danube in here. As much as possible, avoid making camp in thickly wooded areas or pitching your tents near such places. Guess why? Because the Slavs are in the wood. And again, so this makes you really understand how much the Slavs were functionalized in that kind of warfare, right? They were paradigmatically there. That's what they would stay, right? And try to take them out. It's not easy, right? So, and you have to watch out. Especially for night attacks during, when you encamp in these areas, for they can easily serve as a base for launching attacks or for rustling horses, right? Also, this fact of getting away the Byzantine horses and livestock, it's important because they naturally, that was a hell of an asset, and could give them even mounted forces at that point. Definitely, the Slavs developed their cavalry also on Byzantine imitation, just the ones of the peoples of the steppes, that however was dramatically, probably definitely more important actually for the Slavs overall. The infantry force should encamp in order within the fortification, so keep them out. The cavalry should encamp outside with sentinels posted in a wide circle around the grazing horses, unless it's possible to bring in forage for the horses so they can stay inside day and night. This is interesting because it tells you naturally that this thing of making horses eat is a very long thing. It requires a great space, so sometimes you have to stay out, but also you have to keep a cavalry force just as a deterrent so that you can pursue them, right? And naturally it's a risky business. You have to keep sentinels all around, and you have the infantry could be caught by the enemy in the open, could not get away in time, right? We've seen that the Slavs have few cavalry themselves, but on foot they can probably outrun you, right? Also because they're lighter, they're more likely equipped, they know better the terrain and so on. If an opportunity for battle occurs, do not make your battle line against them too deep. Do not concentrate only on frontal attacks, but on the other sectors as well, for avoiding encirclements and outflankings and so on. Suppose that the enemy occupy a fairly strong position and have their rear well covered so that they do not allow us an opportunity to encircle them or attack their flanks or their rear. In that event, it is necessary to post some troops in concealment. Have others simulate a flight before their front, so that, lured by the hope of pursuit, they may abandon their good defensive position, and then our men will turn back against them, while those in hiding come out and attack them. Here the defensivistic attitude and tactics of the Slavs, right? They tend probably to entrench themselves, to settle on hilltops, and to render more difficult even, there is probably a sound, attention on position too, right? And this is important for an enemy that is less, is less armed in general, and that exploits terrain wherever it's possible. So in order to, and always stay open, because they could surround you anyway. That is, they're kind of stout defenders, but and you should dislodge them from there in a way. But also be careful, because where you move around, because they might have put a trap, and the best way is to lure them frontally, to make them think you're actually retreating, so that they can be bold and descend from these places for this good defensive position. and there you can dispose of them more easily. Since there are many kings amongst them, always at odds with one another, it is not difficult to win over some of them by persuasion or by gifts, especially those in areas closer to the border, and then to attack the others so that their common hostility will not make them united or bring them together under one ruler. Naturally, if the enemy is divided, the better it is, right? As we have seen, the Byzantines on the long run will manage to absorb this, Slavic occupied territories, at least on the right bank of the Danube, generally, not everywhere, but still essentially nurturing this, foreign-minded population still under, within the borders of your own empire. As long as these people, produce agricultural goods, they bring them into the Byzantine markets, you can make them pay taxes. It's kind of fine. Right, the Nubian Frontier is very wild. There's not much of a population. It's militarized frontiers, right? The Byzantines are present mostly in fortified garrisons, and as it will be for the Ottomans later on, right? But definitely the Slavs in the southern areas will progressively be absorbed by the Romans. And the so-called refugees who are ordered to point out the roads and furnish certain information must be very closely watched, right? So yeah, you can divide them kind of easily, but never trust them fully. Even some Romans have given it into the times, forget their own people and prefer to gain the goodwill of the enemy, right? He's naturally talking, ex post, even think about Italy that had been invaded just by the Longobards recently. Some places just held, they gave their cities away without much of a problem, and those who remain loyal ought to be rewarded and the evildoers punished. Provisions found in the surrounding countryside should not simply be wasted, but use pack animals and boats to transport them to our own country, the rivers there flowing to the Danube, which makes transportation by boat easy. So there is even an economical prescription how to cope. Always check the supplies, the granaries, surveil the expeditions, because the Slavs are probably going to raid them, and instead that's basically where also they also revolve around, because there's all resources that can make them more or less active. If you deprive them of them, they'll also be less dangerous. Infantry are necessary not only in narrow passes and fortified places, but also in rough country and along rivers. Even in the face of the enemy, it is then possible to bridge over them. When a small force of infantry, both heavy and light, has been secretly brought across at night or during the day, and immediately drawn up in formation, keeping their backs to the river, they will provide enough security to put a bridge across the river. In cramped river crossings or in the file, it is necessary for the rear guard to be ready for action at all times, disposed according to the terrain. For one may expect attacks to occur whenever the force is divided. This is interesting because naturally that's the best tactic you can adopt against a Roman army that is exactly derives most of its strength from its union, for its integrity, its collective training, its coordination, and the troops who are advancing cannot aid those in the rear. Surprise attacks against the enemy should be carried out according to standard procedure. One detachment approaches their front and provokes them, while another detachment, infantry or cavalry, is posted secretly in the rear on the route by which they are expected to flee. The enemy then, who avoided action or who flee from the first attacking force, will unexpectedly run right into the other detachment. In summer there must be no let-up in hurting them. During that time of year we can pillage the more open and bare areas and aim at entrenching ourselves in their land. This will aid the Romans who are captives among them to gain their freedom after escaping from them. The thick foliage of summer makes it fairly easy for the prisoners to escape without fear. right? This is very interesting. I mean, attack them in summer so that they don't have much resistance to opposing open ground. You can essentially take their supplies and entrench for the winter, and it's easier for even prisoners of this Roman, these Romans that were, at this point, we're in the 6th century, the real moment in which the Slavs had arrived and occupied this Roman-held territory. So there were lots of Roman subjects that wanted to, to get free from the Slavs, right? So they would be more likely to flee in summer because, the vegetation is thicker and it can escape more easily, right? Just think about this dimension in 6th century Balkans. It's very fascinating. The procedures of the march, the invasion and the pillaging of the country and other more or less related matters are dealt with in the book on invading hostile territory. Here the subjects will be summarized as best as possible. The settlements of the Slavs and Antas lie in a row along the rivers, very close to one another. In fact, there is practically no space between them, and they are bordered by forests, swamps, beds of reeds. As a result, what generally happens to invasions launched against them is that the whole army comes at halt at their first settlement and is kept busy there, while the rest of neighboring settlements, on learning the invasion, easily escape with their belongings to the near first. This is amazing, right? There is this line along the river. From one side you have the river, from the other side you have these villages in open ground, but next to them there is like either forests, swamps, right? And when the Romans attack along the river, wherever they arrive from, the Slavs concentrate to halt them, so that the rest of the population and other communities can escape in the forests, right? With their belongings. So think about how few their belongings were in general. Think about the poverty of this reality, right? I can't stress this enough. This is all dictated by reasons of elementary survival. Right? This is a reality where if you don't behave like this, there's no way out you're going to make it, right? Their fighting men then come back ready for action, seize their opportunities, and attack our soldiers from cover, right? So from the forests, as we've seen, they launch these attacks constantly. This prevents the invading troops from inflicting any damage on the enemy, right? So this is the point. Like, if you attack a civilized people, you destroy their cities, is a huge damage, because that's a place where, there are major stocks and supplies and manufacturers and infrastructures and everything. These guys can run away just, with a few things, and there is nothing left to destroy. So this whole invasion is in part useless. For these reasons, we must make surprise attacks against them, particularly in unexpected places. Which means, in turn, given the kind of the spatial sketch has been given in here, that you should attack them either from the rivers or from the forests yourself. So this naturally means, think about how we made a video actually on the Slavic auxiliaries, among others, in the Byzantine armies themselves. Of course, there was plenty of Slavs that would be trained to do the same things, right? By the way, the fact that they could cross rivers so quickly doesn't tell you anything. They were doing constantly against each other, right? And that's why they were also so skilled. The bandits or tagmas must be so arranged beforehand that they know which one is first, which second, which third, and they should march in that order through very constricted areas, so they do not get mixed up and lose time in reorganizing themselves. When a crossing has been made without detection, if there are two suitable places which can be attacked, the army ought to be divided in two, right? So you came from this unexpected directions. If there is all this line of settlements, don't attack one by one, because otherwise they're going to do the same. Attack them all together with smaller parties, right? With the lieutenant general attacking one part, ready for battle, and without a baggage train, and advance a distance of 15 or 20 miles through unsettled land on their flanks, with a view to launching an attack from the more mountainous areas, right? so cut them the retreat even over the hills and the mountains. Then on approaching the settlements there, he should begin the pillaging, continuing until he meets the units with the general. The general, keeping the other part of the army, should invade and pillage from the other end of the settlements. Right, this is clever, right? So that there's a pincer movement at the same time. Both should be advancing, destroying and pillaging the settlement between them until they meet up with one another in a determined place. Right, so nobody escapes in the process, hopefully. On arriving there, they should pitch camp together towards evening. In this way, the attack is successfully carried out. The enemy running away from one detachment will unexpectedly fall right into the hands of the other, and it will not be able to regroup. If there is only one suitable road by which it is possible to invade the settlements, the army should still be divided. The lieutenant general must take half or even more of it, a strong force and ready for battle without a baggage train. His own band with himself in his proper place should advance at the head of the whole force, and accompanying him should be all the Tagma commanders. When his force approaches the first settlement, he should detach one or two bandits, so while some go about pillaging, others may keep guard over them, right? Because as we have seen, the Slavs may even attempt this feigned retreat to eventually attack the enemy when he's looting, so always keep a guard. Right, this was normal actually, but this is a larger force than the usual, right? There's always someone guarding the foragers, preferably cavalry in that regard. Also because when you pillage, you're spread out, so that's the best, chance you're gonna fall into. It's risky even to attack the local villages because even the population may rebel. If you're too scattered, that can be a trap. And for when our army it is wise not to attach too many bandits for the first settlements, even if they happen to be large ones. For when our army arrives, there is no time for the inhabitants to organize any resistance. This is also interesting. That is to say, these Slavic villages are basically they're not meant as the place where you have to fight, which is paradoxical in the sense that of course the Slavs will build this entrenched. Think about the guard in Poland, or these other fortified centers that are normal. But in general, we are talking about the 6th century. These villages are not seen as the place where you want to make a stand, right? You better run in forests and start from there, right? This is once again very meaningful for describing the kind of society the Slavs were living. The lieutenant general should continue his advance rapidly while still carrying out the same procedure for the rest of the settlement along the way, as long as there are enough Tagmas under his command. The lieutenant general himself ought to stay clear of all these actions. He should retain for himself 3 or 4 bandits up to 1,000 capable men until the invasion is completely finished, so he can see the reconnaissance and security for the rest of the troops. While the lieutenant general is discharging these duties, the general should follow along, have the pillaging troops join him, and keep moving up towards the lieutenant general. For his part, the lieutenant general should turn back and gather up the pillagers along his line of march. In the place where the two encounter each other, they should set up camp together that same day. These surprise incursions made by the two units should not advance more than 15 or 20 miles, so that both may get there, do their pillaging, and pitch camp on the same day. In these expeditions, those of the enemy able to put up resistance need not to be taken alive, but kill everyone you encounter and move on. This is ferocious, but is explainable because it really gives no chance whatsoever to exist at that point. Right, everybody you meet is going to get killed. So the Slavs will learn that, and they know that in the first day, there's no way you're going to be alive if you attempt a resistance, right? So that you can really make them get away and leave everything they have there, if possible, before they can prepare to get out, as we've seen before, with a minimum, even with a minimal resistance. This is important because you're attacking at least the centers where they have the minimal that allows them to live, right? This agriculture, livestock, etc. And when you are marching along, do not let them delay you, but take advantage of the opportunity. That is to say, also, like these Slavs are not operating in a very concentrated fashion. So even if it's definitely risky to enter in enemy territory and leave even, potentially hostile population behind, do not worry so much, because tendentially they do not come in the open to, cut your retreat, or they prefer to remain in those areas to contrast you, especially at the beginning, right? They will mostly reorganize to maybe impede your retreat at the end of the campaign, but by that point just do as much damage as you can. Now there is this last passage that is at the end actually of this that we skip it, because it's basically saying, okay, now we have given this information about all these various peoples, including the Slavs, not just the Slavs, and but every situation is different, so adapt according to circumstances. There are other small passages on the Slavs in the Strategicon that deal, for example, with for example, here it says that the Slavs and the Antas and our peoples are usually indisciplined and disorganized, right? And as we have seen, you can invade their lands pretty easily at the beginning, right? Also, another passage here says that the troops, some Byzantine troops, must be equipped with certain those who are less, for example, are less capable than shooting bows, right? They should be armed with small javelins or lances of Slavic type. Those we have seen before, right? With that combination of light javelins and some large shields that are, you're basically having multiple missiles, but also having, as a consequence, in this Slav against Slav fight, larger shields to cover from those same darts. And now we read the 20th chapter of the 12th book of the Strategicon that deals actually with specifically the Balkanic area, at least the Nubian Frontier, that is those areas that are populated by the Slavs and the Antas, traversing of wooded areas, rough terrain, and narrow passes by infantry, right? That is typically attached to the areas where the Slavs lived. And here we go with the text. For a successful expedition against an enemy in wooded areas, rough terrain, and narrow passes, especially against the Slavs and Antas, the troops should be lightly equipped and without many horsemen. They should march without wagons. Their baggage train should not be large, nor should they have heavy armament such as helmets and mail coats. Right, so light troops, possibly on foot. Right, so they're basically imitating the same Slavs. They're tending toward that direction. Mostly lightly armed infantry that, as we have seen before in the chapter on the Slavs, are the kind of troops from which the Slavs suffer the most, apparently. Also, they should march with slower, amount of train, and so that naturally this limits their strategic range, but at the same time avoids eventual, loss of material falling into the enemy hands, right? The heavy armed troops should carry moderate-sized shields, short spears, not the kind used by the cavalry. So this is probably to fight on rough terrain where things like the long lance is too cumbersome, unwieldy. The light armed men should, and the same goes for shields. The light armed men should have smaller shields, lighter bows and arrows, right? So even in here, the point is, it's not even important to have more powerful weapons, as we'll see now that in forested areas, actually, you can even have a powerful weapon, but that's going to be less effective for questions of size and of sight and space. The important here is to be light, right? To be able to run around, to move on this difficult terrain. It already puts a lot of physical strains. You don't have to be heavier than you should, right? And this is why probably the same Slavs had, apparently not great bows, but still using them at this shorter range that is ideal in that regard. Short spears, short Moorish javelins, by the way, and some metal darts. They should get all the available axes and have them carried by the pack animals for use when needed. Right? The Slavs are also told to throw axes, actually, as well as rocks from hilltops and having this, whatever the hell you can throw from the high, you can. That is exploiting banally the gravity in a situation where you don't have many and much powerful weapons yourself. But if you throw them from the bow, that is gonna be more. Those are gonna be more effective. The heavy infantry force should not be drawn up in a straight line or front as in flat and open country, but depending on the size of the force, into 2 or 4 units, 2 or 4 ranks deep. It should march by the flank, as shown in the diagram below that now we don't have. Basically, it's like a front with all segmented in 4 parts. That's what I meant. And but depending on the size, okay, it should march by the flank as shown in the diagram, adapting to the needs of the situation, and its units should march along straight about a stone's throw apart. Right, that is not very, very distant, of course. If cavalry or baggage trains are present, the trains should be placed in the rear, followed by the cavalry, and behind them should be a few heavy and light infantry as a rear guard to ward off likely surprise attacks from the rear. Right, so if you go into Slavic territory, just prepare to have attacks on the rear and having a mix of all the types of troops to cope against the enemy in that sense, so that you're not unprepared. There is cavalry, but also few heavy and light infantry attached. Some of the light infantry, accompanied by a small unit of cavalry, should proceed about a mile ahead of the main body. Right, so the rear guard naturally also to defend the train, and a vanguard to see what the hell is going on ahead. Others should march on both flanks to patrol and to discover any enemy ambushes. They should look carefully for trees which seem to be standing upright, but which have been sowed partway through, so they can be quickly pushed over to block those narrow places in which a surprise attack can cause serious trouble. Right, so naturally the typical ambush styles to block the road with tree logs, or to let them roll on the enemy from the above in these valleys and so on. The light infantry, accompanied by a few horsemen, should be on the alert for such stratagems, and at the same time should clear out any enemy troops in the hiding, right? Because the enemy is going to patrol the area, to scout the area, same way. The main body may then pass through, right? So prevent ambush as much as you can, of course. And where the country is fairly open, the cavalry should ride in advance to patrol, but where it is thick and difficult, the light infantry. Right, so obviously wooded or uneven terrain is not the best option for cavalry, while light infantry is relatively at ease with it. The light infantry ought not to be drawn up in close order as is the heavy infantry, but in irregular groups, so that is 3 or 4 armed with javelins and shields, so they may protect themselves if necessary while hurling the javelin. They should also have one archer to provide covering fire from them. This is very interesting because it talks literally about pairs like of javeliners that are already, throwing their missile against the enemy, but must be covered by a more, precise weapon like a bow, and going like in this irregular parties through the woods, through the difficult terrain. Right, it is probably what the Slavs are fighting like in the same fashion. These little groups, as remarked above, should not march along in one solid formation, nor should they be widely scattered, but they should be one after the other to protect each other's rear. If something should happen to the leading group, if, for example, they encounter resistance from the enemy or get bogged down in rough terrain, the groups behind them may move up to higher ground without being observed and come down upon the enemy's rear. This must always be the objective of the light armed troops, to seize higher ground and get above the enemy. Right? This is very important indeed, because as we've seen, this is what the Slavs are doing typically. Right? Reaching the higher grounds, throwing the hell down on the enemy. Right? So if you get the higher ground instead, they're definitely not in a better position than you are, even compared to those who are down. And the light infantry should be instructed not to go any further from the main body than where they can hear its trumpets or bugles. So naturally, these units must always operate at a safe distance, at least at a distance from which you can signal if something is going wrong, right? And naturally, these are extremely risky tasks, and we wouldn't be surprised. We were saying before that this might have been performed by the same Slavic auxiliaries, as a matter of fact. Otherwise, they may well find themselves cut off from support and be overpowered. Suppose that the 4 divisions of the main body who are marching along by the flanks come to spot so narrow that all 4 cannot pass. Right? So naturally, this formation is meant to, to cover enough ground to remain at a safe distance and to sweep basically all you find in the middle. But naturally, terrain is not always suitable. So in this case, come to a spot now, then 2 divisions should fall back. Right, so they go in the rear and form a double column. If the place is too narrow for 2 divisions, then have one at a time pass, lining itself up in one column by the flank, and the rest following, always, of course, keeping the light armed troops out in front. Right, so the most important thing is that you have this light infantry in the front that can meet with first with an expected resistance, so that they can come to grips with the enemy with the best arms in that regard. The whole idea here is that the heavy infantry could even naturally be a difficulty on a difficult terrain, so that the lightly armored Slavs can bog them down, surround them, outmarch and outflank them, whatever, and maybe taking them down, right, over time. So light infantry is crucial in this regard as well, because being more lightly armored doesn't necessarily mean to be more an advantage, right? Sometimes it's much more advantageous to be lighter and to be able to run away more quickly than given a certain situation than actually being full armor and having problems. As we've seen here, the whole scenario is preferably copable with less less armor, right, and lighter weaponry also in general. And after passing the narrow place, they resumed the original formation of 4 units or divisions marching by the flank. If a strong enemy force appears in front of them or off to the side, they must form the front of the battle line in that section which is threatened. If, for example, the enemy appears to the left of the column, the Maras on that flank holds in position, and the other 3 come and line up in their proper positions relative to it. Right? The point here is that you don't have to. I mean, if you're attacked, you should remain where you are. You shouldn't retreat, because that is potentially dangers. We have seen how the Slavs fundamentally get hyped if by attacking with these shouts and getting close, you start retreating. They're going to push onward. So the idea is you have to remain where you are and remaining steady, because generally speaking, the imperial troops are more firm, more capable of coping with these assaults and not losing control, so that you can give time to the other divisions to come support you in that regard. And as we have seen, the Slavs eventually are not great fans of getting to close range with drilled and well-equipped infantry, so they will probably retreat once again in the woods. And naturally, this is just maybe talking about the average, not really about what can happen, because of course the Slavs could assault and wipe out this whole thing, depending on whichever the strengths involved really were. If the enemy appears to the right, the corresponding maneuver is made and the front formed in that direction. If they appear in front of either one or both of the center divisions, the other two head towards the right, deploying from a column into a line, and form the battle with their flank as the front. Right, so minimize the movement to redeploy, banal, but always fundamental tip. If the terrain permits our troops to march in close order against the enemy, then the slight armed infantry and cavalry should circle around the enemy. Right. But if the close order formation is not practicable, then line up the heavy infantry files more in depth and with wider gaps between them, so they can easily make their way through wooded areas, and if need be, resume close order. Right. That is, if you can maintain this close array, just do it so you can eventually send troops to encircle the enemy, and if the thing goes wrong, you can revert to that base, right, of operation, as the infantry especially put in defense. If you can't, just if you're in this claustrophobic situation, just maintain an array that allows you eventually to disperse, but also to regain formation quickly, right, so that you minimize the time to deploy in the most convenient formation. If even this is not feasible, the main body should halt, while the light infantry, close supported by a few heavy armored men and cavalry, should be sent out against the enemy. So here also a cooperation between cavalry and light infantry that definitely doesn't harm, considering also, as we've seen, the Slavs had relatively few cavalry. But here in this scenario, we've seen also that cavalry has difficulty on the terrain, so this cooperation must be always cautious. Instructions should be given to the army that in the event that while it is marching along, an alarm is sounded that the enemy is nearby, the whole army should not become excited and race towards the section, right? So do not hurry towards the enemy like saying, "Oh, well, we found them." Look, this sounds like a hunting. We've seen before. The Slavs are dealt with like brigands, right? And in this terrain where you're actually searching for them, because you can't see them, right? So think about the anxiety, the tension, and saying, "Oh, well, where's the enemy? Where's the enemy?" And this immediate feel to rush towards the enemy, with the adrenaline, to just forget about this constant pressure on you. That's exactly what the enemy wants, right? So that you abandon formation, you come to the enemy, maybe en masse but disorderly, and they can exploit your weaknesses, right? So no, everybody should remain on post, right? This may be even an ambush. They may be even at your rear, as far as you're concerned. The heavy armed troops should maintain their formation, while the light infantry dashes towards the men who gave the alarm, right? So here, light infantry is really the always on the move, always deployable. Quickly deployable to meet with the enemies that are probably going to even make hit and run tactics. So the point is also, light infantry is not just the best to find a certain terrain, or the best equipped to attack the distance with missile, as we've seen the Slavs are vulnerable, but literally they are also the quickest ones who can run on the spot, while the Slavs may, just bite and run away, right? So that's also the economy of the thing. The troops in the front should not hastily move to the flanks, nor those on the flank to the front except as ordered by their commanding officer. Each mass should support its own troops in times of alarm, as each situation demands. In the event that the troops are being hard pressed, they should hurry back to the main body of infantry, so they will not be overwhelmed by the enemy. Infantry therefore is able to undertake a march in safety and good order, as we have said, in thickly wooded and difficult country. If they march by the flank, either in 4 divisions or 2, depending on the terrain, and in more open country using a formation with the front on the flank, if they keep their files fairly wide and deep. It should be borne in mind that in thickly wooded country, javelin throwers are needed more than archers or slingers. This is important, and that explains you why the Slavs are famous for their javelins, because that's exactly the environment where they fight, right? For this reason, most of the light infantry should be trained in using javelins and short spears. Archers, rather, are needed in close connection with the main battle line and in rough, steep, narrow, and open country. Javelin throwers, for their part, should be stationed away from the main line and are particularly needed in thickly wooded areas, so you even need to spare them for that specific context, while in open field, it's better, to increase, to use weapons that can exploit the space that is at disposal, right? So do not. I mean, using a javelin is not easy. So these troops also have a training, specific quality. You don't throw them away in an open ground, right? Where they are even at disadvantage. Toward most of the rest of the troops at some point. The security of our entrenchments and camps is important. If possible, the tents should be pitched in open country, but if this cannot be done, we cannot become careless, right? That is, you should deploy the camp in an area that allows an easy redeployment, right? Not in, disconnected terrain where the enemy can even, catch it by surprise. So always make the Slavs coming out, right, in order to, in open ground where they're more vulnerable. This is the concept. Our camps should be tightly guarded and strong, because that's what the Slavs are going to do. They're going to attack you, especially at night. Avoid these places which have higher ground close by. As we have seen before, the Slavs are going to take the higher ground, so that this is where they're going to attack you from. More preferably, do not expose yourself to that. Do not dismiss the main body of troops until everyone has pitched his tent, right? That is, never lose the guard, never lower the guard, and the camp is properly fortified and patrols have been sent out. So even checking around while you're encamping. So this is always a precarious situation, but you don't know what is out there, right? Everyone must remember that the blast of the bugle is the signal to halt, and the blast of the trumpet is the signal to march. We have appended some sketches for a clear. Okay, here it is, just a representation. Okay, so we're not reading Leo the Wise's Tactica, as he largely repeats, actually, even narrowly telling the truth, repeats what the Strategicon says. The same thing, if the Slavs are caught in the open, they could be ridden down. He doesn't record their tactics for a set battle, right? It tells the same thing of the women, of the poisoned arrows, of the shields that he calls interestedly tureoi in Greek, which is the larger tureos, meaning. At this point, we don't really know, because originally speaking, tureos were this larger shields used by the Celts and by the Italics that the Greeks back in antiquity even created in a smaller version of it, but the etymology was a door, like being very large. So here I think that he uses, possibly in a distinctive way, the term tureos, right, and to stress the fact maybe that these were larger in rectangular shields, like the one of the design that we find even from archaeology we're talking about before, specialized for functionalized to deal with missile fire. And for the rest, we can talk a little bit more about the later times. I mean, what really changes in Slavic warfare. As we were saying at the beginning, half of millennium history is difficult to express in a few words, right? So later sources compared to the Strategicon and the Tactica refer, for example, to wedges and multiple lines, several ranks deep of the Slavic formations, which are fundamentally similar to the same Germanic ones we find, for example, even during Viking era. This is interesting because these peoples really were at close contact with the same, with the Germans and the Scandinavians in general, and the Baltic was actually crossed both by Scandinavian as much as Slavic pirates, for not talking about Russia, where we define as Varangian, as Viking, let's say. It's now being mostly like kind of identified as largely a Slavic, phenomenon. Like, yes, there were these chieftains and their or at least warlords and retinues coming from Scandinavia, like, and taking power locally, but most of the local troops and also the oligarchies, the elites, were Slav, right? So it's very difficult to distinguish these two things, and we will talk about them more in detail when we talk about the Kievan Rus and that specific warfare, aside from the Slavs in general, from the migration era. And consider also that the Baltic Slavs are the ones who tendentially seem in fact to have gotten less transformation from the original warfare, right? They remain mostly infantry, right? Which is something that this is just a minority of the Slavs, because even in places like Poland or Bohemia, actually cavalry began to be substantially developed at some point. Also because of actually Frankish influence, not just the one of the steppes, like you can see with the Pechenegs and the Magyars, that definitely have a great impact on development, especially of the Russian and of the Bohemian cavalries, right? That were dialoguing with them, oligarchically speaking, they were definitely imitating all these various models. The idea is that, objectively, the Bohemian and Polish cavalries by the 10th and the 11th century do not seem to have been particularly different from the ones of their Frankish counterparts, right? They were being, especially the Western Poles and the Bohemians. Eastern Poland was definitely much more under the influence of the steppes, and the at least southeastern, right? Let's take this axis, northwest, southeast, and of course the essentials of the Slavic equipment didn't vary much, right? The Slavs were massively impacted by the steppes peoples, but they always maintained a clear sedentary outlook, right? Helmets, coats of mail, these large round shields that are typical basically of every people out there in Europe at the time, and swords, sabers, the influence of the steppes that was felt sometimes, but at this point, even in the steppes, actually straight swords of kind of Persian Iranic influence were still somewhat prevalent, seemingly, and even here generalizing doesn't quite help. And we can say that overall the picture is also of an increased structuration of the political and social forms, right? You start seeing more solid dominions, in which cavalry was important because of course these areas were these dominions were very large, right? If you compare them even from later times where feudalism had kind of built up sounder base at the local level, right? Even in terms of territorialization, fortification, right? The dynamics were different. But if you look at the genesis of Poland, for example, it's an enormous space. It was brought under control, under of course, a long time. In later times, after the Piast's fragmentation, was even more difficult to put together once again because of this increased territorialization. So obviously, the Slavs in the Slavic oligarchies and in general these rulers, these princes that emerged, had sometimes a very wide range of action. Right. The problem was, committing the various communities to be under you if they had an interest, etc. And the process of centralization was naturally very at an embryonal stage, and it's mostly in fact the areas closer to the Frankish border that got the sounder stabilization over time. If you look at Bohemia, for example, they compacted their domains pretty quickly, and it remained fundamentally a unitary body, also because it was more contained by itself, but also because it was, say, closer to civilization. We can say even Germany was very far from being, as you know, a central monarchy as such. But that's where countries like Poland, like Bohemia, and even Hungary, that, as we've seen, was bringing still this culture of the steppes out, that irradiating it, were absorbed by, right? Whereas Russia, most typically, and the Balkans were obviously more under the Byzantine influence, and more broadly this Pontic kind of Eurasian, even Middle Eastern influence. If you look at typical Middle Eastern equipment, you can find it up to Sweden in a very consistent way, actually, because the trade routes there with the Great Russian rivers, the Caspian Sea, Persia, were all those ones, right? And there was a lot of, actually, even in there, that's a kind of forgotten scenario. We'll have to deal with the Kazakh Empire, for example, that there was very, very influencing. It had also, there was an area had connections even with Hungary over the Danubian context, like that. That's all a dimension that across Europe and Asia that had even certain specific military characters on their own. I hope we're going to cover that soon. We have definitely this in many cases. Even if I studied, as you know, the Longobard history. If you look at the what would be this Slovenian Friulan border between the Duchy of Friuli and the Slavs from in the east, Slavic Frontier, the Croats, the Slovens, you see this recurrent thing of the fortified hilltop from where the Slavs entrenched themselves and threw the hell against them, against the enemy, in terms of stones, javelins, axes. This is documented even against the Carolingian armies in Bohemia. These areas always remained also very difficult to control, as the strategically was saying before. The main problem with this posed by the Slavs was that they didn't really have a center that by occupying it you would gain fundamentally a domination over them, right? Think about even the dominators of the Pannonian plain, where the Avars or the Magyars, like they tried countless times to subdue, the surrounding Slavs, the Slovaks, the Bohemians, but they wouldn't make it, right? It was too difficult. They would raid these lands, they would kill, they would slave, whatever, but this population would grow once again, because there was no way to create a stable domination in there that actually didn't stem from the Slavs themselves, so that, as we've seen, would take some time actually to even manage to start a process, of subtle construction. So I would say that there is really also kind of a geographical character, usually, especially if you look at the Pannonian plain, that's where also some Slavs definitely lived before even just between the Avars and the Magyars, and there had been some instability that allowed further settlement, but and of course these peoples were kind of steppicized by the new waves coming from the Volga, like with the Magyars. But the surrounding mountains, whether it be the Alps or the Sudetenland or the Carpathians, this would remain also, if you look at archaeologically speaking, with a much clearer Slavic, and I would say even particularly European character, because the Slavic weapons at this time did not differ much from what would be fundamentally even the Frankish culture in terms. Of course, there were important differences, but there's no real boundary that you can identify. The process of fortification was also very important. Certain agglomerations, like if you look at Bohemia, other territories, even Russia, started out of this fortificated fortresses constructed exactly for dealing primarily with the raids of the nomadic peoples, whether it be the Magyars, the Pechenegs, respectively. And this is where the Slavs usually withdrew in winter, right? As we have seen, the attacks during the winter time were also preferable in some extreme weather, because with frozen rivers it was easier to attack these lands, right? So naturally, these centers were initially began like supply depots, right? And eventually they attracted population and developed into important settlements and cities, even today European capitals, and also especially imagine in the flatland, it is difficult to build a defense. You must to find a defense in the ground, so you must build one, right? And usually the Asiatic nomads were regarded as poor in siege work. For example, when the Magyars attacked Augsburg in 955, they had to bring these siege engines driven forward by whips, right? And this is normal because the nomads, in fact, do not have to cope with sedentary peoples that can fortify and entrench themselves, right? But this is also a bit of a stereotypical picture, because if you look at the Avars, for example, but even the Magyars themselves had displayed on multiple occasions actually some important siege warfare capabilities, and actually these populations were importantly influenced by the Middle Eastern siege warfare. So even the thing in here is probably too stereotypical, but aside from siege engines or not, the need for fortification was necessary, right? And that's where also this picture of the Slavs as fanatic defenders eventually emerged from, because as we have seen from the Strategicon, that it talks about a very primitive reality in the 6th century, shows these peoples as not even having defendable settlements, right? If you had asked the Carolingian troops driving into Bohemia, they would have thought something different, right? The Slavs, as we've seen, also had a naval capability, right? Both we've seen it in the Adriatic, part also in the Black Sea, in the Baltic, and for sure. And we know of ships that were substantially small, right? The Croats rose up, could carry up to 20 or 40 men per ship in the largest kind, but on average were like 10, right? And this is probably also what the early Germanic piracy was really about in some areas, even when the Germans settled in the Western Europe. But the thing evolved, right? Those areas, think about the Ushkots in the Adriatic. Those would last well into the modern age. So these were communities that lived in this quite tormented coasts, right, with lots of gulfs and islets and also difficult hinterland. It was very difficultly attackable, right? The Balkans, really, the Dinaric Ridge, for example, were important divides historically, culturally. I mean, think about, how close countries like, Serbia or Italy are geographically, right, in a line straight, but how, totally, very different, at least, cultures that there are in there, the languages, etc. So this naturally, the idea of the wilder hinterland and the kind of civilized coast has always been a big deal, especially in the Mediterranean. And the Slavs are mostly, however, a terrestrial continental power, except for the Russians that objectively develop something more, right? They do definitely. They're well served by waterways and access some of the most important trade routes to dominate by sea. So they implement that. But naturally, also in the Slavs we've seen were pretty skilled at crossing rivers according to the Strategicon, but we don't have any specific news of particularly advanced river warfare other than these small parties of ships going to raid and cross and pillage and things like these. It's needless to say the Slavs also employed, when especially they began to build some polities of some steadiness, also foreign troops, right? And especially in the east, there were lots of Turk auxiliary or archers, right? So that's also where they get part of their own equestrian skills themselves. By the time of the Mongolian invasion, for example, in Russia, the Russians called Svoi Pagania, that means our own pagans, that were basically these Turkic populations that were different naturally from these other steppes, peoples coming from the outer, from Mongolia in that case, but also in others, because these were waves of peoples that had come there from centuries ago and that had fundamentally remained to stay, right? This is typical even of the later settled Mongols or whichever peoples had gone with them. Think about how many settled in places like Hungary or Poland, right? That were actually demanded to settle there because they needed them as auxiliary troops and to integrate them and to even keep them at bay, because we're sometimes quite unruly neighbors in that regard. I would conclude with a remark about the achievements of the Slavs after all. I mean, if the 6th century situation was really the one depicted by the Strategicon, I would definitely know that Eastern Europe at the time of Slavic migrations wasn't definitely much of a particularly advanced place, but I mean, this is debatable if you look at certain cultures in the Baltic, but let's be honest about it. To become, at the beginning of the 11th century, to see this, first of all, the Russian accomplishments that naturally are, the largest ones, right? That is also a culture that eventually being wiped out by the Mongols, being relatively far away from Western Europe, left a few records, but that was a large thing, was a big thing, right? But if it hadn't been for the Russians, even if you look at the Poles or the Bohemians, they developed, right? It was an achievement, right? They managed to create something as stratified society. It's its own, these large clienteles, important political military structures, heavy cavalry, and evolving to kingdoms proper, right? And that is remarkable, right? And I attribute this to for the whole Slavic area, the one that, of course, there were other Slavs that basically fell under someone else's domination. Sometimes managing even to Slavicize properly their own conquerors, like it would happen to the Bulgarians. But the Balkans, aside from a few exceptions, in fact, Bulgaria and Serbia largely, partly also Croatia, did, if you want to include that in the Balkans, fell sooner or later under the orbit of someone else's power, right? Even Russia was invaded by the Mongols, eventually managed to reshape itself on a completely different base from the one of the Kievan Rus, and with massive Tatar influence. But these other peoples had their own spaces, had their own time. They managed to achieve quite a lot, right? And we made some videos, a lot of videos actually on Polish warfare. We also talked about the creation of the Central and Eastern, let's say, the Slavic monarchies, let's put it in this way. So you can go look at that videos. I also created a dedicated playlist to that. And we addressed the process of formation, for example, of Polish cavalry. We made a video about it during the 11th and 13th century. And we will definitely expand the stuff further, because the area is actually much more complex than it seems, right? Even, for example, the Pomeranian piracy, that was a hell of a thing. It's a forgotten chapter. Eventually, Pomeranians, as you know, were wiped out, but even the instability of the area reflects eventually the need for accomplishing a greater cohesion, right? And I would also say that this constant waves of steppe peoples that were keeping pouring into Europe since forever, like, because look at this movement never stopped since the migration era. Really, it began with the Scythians, the Sarmatians, even before in the classical world. We passed through the Huns. You look at the Avars, these people up to the Mongols, and even beyond, right? It always poured into Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, and bringing in this threat, right? This instability that the local communities had to cope with by creating something more stable and unorganized. And if you look at their warfare, you realize that it was, pretty damn effective for that context, and it deserves definitely way more credit, right, than it's usually done, especially the developing of anti-arrow shields in a kind of pavese, large quadrangular forms. It's remarkable, because that's a pattern that remains throughout all the Middle Ages in the Slavic area, right? It's developed basically in similar forms independently, just in Italy, because it was in the 13th century, because it was the places where crossbow warfare was more intense, and eventually the pavese spreads not from these two areas, but for the obvious needs, because of the increase of crossbow warfare basically everywhere. But in the Slavic area, you can find the design, the concept already there, right? You can actually find these designs even earlier than that, and it possibly has not even to do with necessarily the steppes pressure per se. That probably is much more interesting to observe in the development of Slavic cavalry, that, as we have seen, the Slavs stereotypically didn't have at all at the beginning, or at least in virtually insignificant numbers, and that was developed later on, because these quadrangular designs could be found even in, Bronze Age Germany, for example, and you could say that they existed because wherever there was too few armor, so that you needed larger effective shields. But also the idea of the pavese, for example, that emerges in Lithuania in relatively early, at the beginning of the 13th century, and these other designs of quadrangular form that are typical of the broader Slav, southern and eastern mostly, but also western, actually, Slavic area, are really impressed, and it should be probably credited more in this regard. It's the problem, we underestimate human intelligence at the same time. This shouldn't be something to point out, but just to say, look, that it's really like because of those reasons there, and the more it goes on, it's more evenly against missile fire rather. There's another thing I wanted to say. I think I forgot, but in general, there is plenty of stuff to talk about, and I hope we will be doing it soon. For now, I think I'll stop here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.